SOKRATES stands for the study of knowledge and reactions to amyloid testing. It's a companion study to the A4 study. The A4 study is a large international clinical trial testing whether a drug called solanezumab can change the trajectory of cognitive decline seen in older adults who have elevated amyloid. It's one of the first studies being done to test whether we can prevent the onset, or at least delay the onset, of the cognitive problems seen in people with Alzheimer's disease. In order to get into the A4 study, an older adult has to agree to undergo an amyloid PET scan. This is a scan that measures whether there's accumulation of amyloid in their brain. There's two possible results of that PET scan. The first result is that it shows that they have elevated amyloid, and the other result is that they have not elevated amyloid. So to be able to enroll in the A4 study, you have to be between the ages of 65 and 85, have cognitive testing that shows no evidence of impairment, and have a PET scan result that shows elevated amyloid. If you've got all those three things and you're otherwise healthy, you're enrolled in that study. What we did in SOKRATES was call up those people about a month or two after they learned that result and found out from them what they thought of that result, how they made sense of it. Interestingly, most of them expected the result. They expected the result because either they had a family history of dementia, or they themselves were beginning to experience cognitive complaints that they felt might be the earliest symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, or they had both. In general, people understood that the scan was measuring amyloid. Most didn't use the terms elevated or not elevated. Instead, they kind of quickly latched onto the idea that you have to have a certain amount of amyloid to be elevated, and so they would use phrases like, I'm an amyloid accumulator, or I have a sufficient amount, etc. People were frustrated because what they wanted was sort of, what's my number? In other words, you tell me I'm elevated, but how elevated am I? Am I just on the other side of elevated, or am I way elevated? And it was an understandable sentiment because people live in a world now where health is guided by numbers. The higher your cholesterol, the more likely you are to get a heart attack. The lower your bone mineral density, the more likely you'll get a fracture, and we can even calculate the probability of your hip fracture in 10 years. We don't have a number to give you. We don't know what a number means here. We just know that enough amyloid based on a visual read and a quantitative read put together would make you elevated, and that's enough to then try out this drug. Suppose down the road the study works. Suppose solanezumab slows down the rate of cognitive decline seen in individuals with elevated amyloid. Well, then it could become part of clinical practice that when you turn 65, you get an amyloid scan, and if the scan shows elevated amyloid, you get this drug. In the immediate term, what these data tell us is that if we're going to give people categorical results of amyloid scans, elevated, not elevated, positive, negative, eligible, not eligible, we really have to redouble our efforts to educate them that this is how we arrive at this result, elevated, not elevated, positive, negative, and the limits of our ability not to provide further quantification, further specificity that people seem to want. The second thing, though, that we're looking at and that we'll have data on is what's the impact in the long term of learning this information. And we're in the midst now of analyzing the results of interviews with these individuals a year later, plus another group of people who learned that they had not elevated amyloid. So we're able to compare those two groups and find out the impact upon who they shared the result with, the impact of that information on that relationship, who they chose not to share the result with, how it changed the way they feel about their mind and their health, and also how it changed the way they feel about how much time they have left. And those results we're in the midst of analyzing and hope to have those out very soon.